Looks like it's working. Looks like it's working. Yay.
Good.
Okay. Looks like there's a little bit of a lag. All right, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Cool. Okay. Looks like it's working. Yay. Ooh.
Good.
Okay. Oh, I see what's happening. Hang on. Looks like there's a little bit of a lag. All right, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Cool. Okay. Looks like it's working. Yay. Okay. Oh, I see what's happening. Looks like there's a little bit of a lag. Ready? Sorry, hang on. I'm figuring this out. Okay. I see what's happening. I think there's a little bit of a lag. Oh, okay. Sorry, hang on. Now I've figured it out. We're getting there. Okay. So, hi, I'm Catherine Lewin, a staff writer at the Santa Fe Reporter, and I cover the south side of the city. This is the second interview in our Bring a Friend series, where Alex DeVore, the culture editor, and I interview different people from the community each week about all kinds of different topics. So it's a way to both educate Santa Feans and New Mexicans about things going on in our state, as well as raise awareness about our Friends of the Reporter program to support the scrappiest paper in the Southwest. So tonight I'm interviewing Daniel Yohalem, an attorney here in Santa Fe who specializes in First Amendment law, civil rights, and transparency. Dan has stood by the Reporter in many fights for the public's right to know, from challenging former Governor Susana Martinez and her private lawyer's secrecy to a case that's still moving through the courts that we're going to talk about. So our current fight is over whether Santa Feans deserve to know when a cop has been disciplined. So Dan has agreed to spend some time with us tonight discussing the role of the press in a free society and why government transparency is more important than a political slogan. Thanks for being here, Dan, and being patient while I figure out this whole YouTube live stream thing.
You're welcome, Catherine. It's my pleasure.
Great. So first off, I wasn't around when you actually helped the Reporter win those victories against the former governor in her desire to keep public information from citizens. So can you walk us through the broad strokes of the case that's come to be known as SFRV Martinez? And for example, like what were the key victories and losses in that case, and how do they impact the state of transparency now?
So Susana Martinez ran on her campaign as being a very transparent governor. But then when she got in, things weren't quite that way. And the Reporter ran a series of stories over a period of maybe 7 or 8 months. And during that time, and this was back in, I guess, 2014 maybe, and the stories may have actually been in 13. But in any event, the Reporter ran these stories, and article after article dealt with issues of non-transparency, where events were being blocked, and et cetera. So after the Reporter ran this series of stories in, I think it was December of 2015, their PIO at the time stopped communicating fundamentally with the Santa Fe Reporter. And then the Reporter came to me to talk about that problem, and we worked up a lawsuit against the governor. And the lawsuit had two basic sets of claims. One was a completely novel set of claims that my co-counsel, Catherine Murray, and I came up with, and that was under the Free Press Clause of the state constitution. And we were trying to pump some life into that. No cases had ever been brought under it before. And we argued that by shutting out the Santa Fe Reporter in retaliation for the Reporter's coverage, critical coverage that was criticizing the governor, that was a violation of the Free Press Clause. We also brought a series of claims under the Inspection of Public Records Act, IPRA, which is the key. It's like FOIA, like the Freedom of Information Act, which applies to the federal government. IPRA applies to state government and local government. And we brought a series of claims under that. Where we ended up was that the judge decided that there wasn't enough evidence of direct retaliation. And so we lost the free press clause. She said that the fact that the articles ran over that 6-month period and then they started getting frozen out in December, January, February, March, she said that wasn't close enough in time. I respectfully disagree with her, but that's where it was. So we lost the free press claim. On the IPRA claims, we won virtually all of them. We claimed that her calendars were public documents and they were supposed to be released to the public. We claimed that emails that we already had copies of, Santa Fe Reporter had copies of, but when we asked the governor to give us copies of those emails, they were not in the documents they disclosed. We wanted evidence about what her pardons were, what were her rationales for not pardoning people who had applied for pardons. What was her thought process in going through this? They asserted executive and other privilege on those documents. And then lastly, there was a holdup in getting documents. You're supposed to get documents quickly, and we weren't. So under each of those 4 categories, we won more than we lost. And ultimately, the reporter had to reveal all of the documents that we were after. There was one loss that was important to me in that process, and that was having to do with her calendars. She apparently kept 2 sets of calendars. There was a political calendar and a public calendar. And we were after the political calendar as well as the public. We wanted to know who she was meeting with and when. Our argument was, look, she's the governor 24/7. We're paying her 24/7, we the taxpayers, and therefore we're entitled to know that. Her counsel argued that no, she keeps those completely separately, and the office is not involved in any of the political stuff that she's doing. We thought that wasn't true, but the court said, look, this is not a major attack on the governor. We're going to keep you focused. She didn't let us take discovery about how they keep the calendars, and we lost that issue. And I was very disappointed. I thought we should have established the precedent that any governor's calendar, whether it's political or otherwise, is public. Otherwise, we did well. It took a long time. She in resisting the lawsuit filed endless motions. I mean, the case took years. Their counsel kept us going with motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment, objections to discovery. It was a very hard fought case, but ultimately I thought we did pretty well.
Yeah, I remember the story of the calendars was one of the first stories I ever heard at the Reporter. One of my first days in the newsroom, we talked about that. And so let's fast forward to the new case, which might come to be known as SFR v. City of Santa Fe and SFPD. We're suing the city with the help of you and Catherine Murray over whether the fact that a police officer has or hasn't been disciplined for violating SFPD policy is something that people who live here deserve to know. So why is it important for there to be sunlight on this issue?
Well, as we all know, what the police are an arm of our own government. We are the taxpayers. We support the government. We elect the government. We pay for the government. And an element of the government is its use of force. It is its police force. And I think that the police force in particular, but obviously all government activities, have to be transparent. They have to be accountable to the public. The public needs to know who's doing what and who is watching the police. In a time when there are many excessive uses of force by police all over the country, the only check on that is our newspaper reports of it and then citizen political reaction to it. And so it is critical to know, is the city monitoring what the police do? And is the city taking action to rein in or make sure that the police are acting lawfully? What is the city doing to make sure that officers who do use excessive force are appropriately disciplined, trained, and they don't do it again, or fired if they continue to do it? And if we don't do that, then we have a runaway government where the government and its police force are terrorizing the people in the city. And that would be a terrible situation. We have been focusing on this issue for a long time. Santa Fe Reporter and Kate and me and several other lawyers around the state. And there were two exceptions in IPRA that we were concerned about that blocked transparency. One is the so-called law enforcement exception, which allows very limited evidence to be, not evidence, but records to be withheld. And they are records that reveal confidential sources, information, and methods, and any information about somebody who has been accused but not yet charged with a crime. That's the limited exception. But police departments all across the state were claiming that anything that was under investigation did not have to be revealed. They claimed it was basically an investigative exception within the Inspection of Public Records Act. And we litigated that issue. Others litigated that issue. And in the key case of Jones versus the Albuquerque Police Department and the state police, the state Supreme Court, the New Mexico Supreme Court, read the IPRA exception exactly as it was written by the legislature and said, no, you don't get to shield everything just because you think it's under investigation. It's a very narrow, limited focus. That was an important step. The next important step is this case, the one you asked me about, Santa Fe Reporter versus the city of Santa Fe. And in this case, what happened was in 2017, July of 2017, Santa Fe Police Department SWAT officers shot and killed Anthony Benavides, a 24-year-old young man was suffering from schizophrenia. The city ultimately settled a civil lawsuit against them by the family for $400,000. And that's the maximum allowed under state law. And our view was we wanted to know what happened to those officers that were involved in this. If the city paid the maximum, clearly there was something wrong here. And did the city step in and appropriately discipline and train, discipline, and if necessary, terminate these officers? And so on behalf of the Santa Fe Reporter in September of 2018, we filed an IPRA request for the document showing any discipline imposed on Jeremy Bisagna, one of the officers who fatally shot Benavides. In that situation, the district court denied our request. And I don't want to get into this, it's too technical, but there are two different ways you could bring an IPRA case. There's a writ of mandamus, and there's a regular civil suit. We brought this as a writ of mandamus, this first case. It's an abbreviated way of litigating, and the judge said in that situation, well, there are these appellate cases that protect information concerning discipline, so you can't have these documents. The city then told us that actually there was no discipline. And that's really what the Santa Fe Reporter wanted to know. And so based on that information, there was no reason to appeal anything. At that point, there were no records to get. But then Santa Fe Reporter asked for discipline records concerning Lieutenant Benjamin Valdez and three other officers, Officer Nick Wood, Officer Jaquan Matherson, and Officer Ladislas Sabo. And Valdez was involved in the Benavides shooting. The other three officers had been involved in peculiar situations, even either a vehicular crash or some kind of escalation that led to other kinds of uses of force. One of the officers was accused of improperly shooting through the door of a home. They were all excessive force cases. And so Santa Fe Reporter asked for those, and this time they were denied, and we were told, not only are we denying your request, we won't even tell you whether there are any documents or not. And that's where we were. So we filed this lawsuit, and the city moved to get it dismissed from the outset, and it was assigned to Judge Brian Beachide, and he ruled, no, we've stated a claim under the act, and we're going to go forward and see what these records look like. And he took a look at them, and then he relied on basically the same appellate cases as Judge Schaefer had done in the first instance with the first officer. And he said, look, there's this appellate case law. I've got to abide by it. I'm a district court judge. And he ruled against us. We have now filed an appeal. We are now in the Court of Appeals. And our job basically is to try to get the Court of Appeals and possibly ultimately the state Supreme Court to overturn 4 appellate decisions that date from the 1970s. And these appellate decisions are basically old law, and they don't reflect where we are today. And at an earlier point in time, I think there wasn't as much interest by the public in these kinds of records. And again, what we're asking for is simply, do you have any records showing these officers were considered for discipline, and were they disciplined? That's what we're asking for. And the city has relied on an exception that says that matters of opinion in personnel files, records, are not disclosable. And what the legislature had in mind in this exception to IPRA was, if you've got an evaluation about somebody, their job evaluation, or if somebody has made a charge against somebody, but it hasn't been validated, it's an opinion. And, it becomes almost like gossip or a rumor, and that's entitled to some protection. The idea is the mere fact that you're a state or city employee doesn't mean you lose all your privacy rights. But I think things have changed substantially, and the legislature has amended IPRA in several ways that we think point away from that ruling. And that ruling was made initially in a case in the 70s when there was a catch-all exception, a rule of reason. Even if it wasn't an exception written down, the courts imposed a new exception, which said that as long as the courts think that there's a problem here, they can do something about it. Well, that was overturned by the New Mexico Supreme Court several years ago, that opinion. And so we think that the whole underpinning of these several appellate decisions was knocked down. And we think that a reconsideration, a new look, balancing the right of public employees to privacy in their own records versus the right of the taxpayer to know about what is happening concerning supervision and discipline of all of our employees, but especially police department, people who carry guns and who use their guns. It's essential. And I think that the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, given a new look at this issue, are going to come out with a very narrow ruling, limited to the language. A matter of opinion in the file will not be released, but the fact of discipline and the reason why they disciplined you, those are not opinions, those are facts. And that's what we're trying to get at.
Right. And right now, there's a nationwide demand for police reform, in particular around use of force, as we all know. And so why do you think, why is transparency around disciplinary records for officers also important when we're just talking about police reform as a whole?
Because if you're going to have a police force, look, what's involved in having a police force? First, you've got to hire people, and you've got to have a quality process to make sure you've got good people being hired. You don't want people who have a chip on their shoulder or people who are extremely aggressive and are using their entry into a police force to just kind of project their aggression out there. You got to be careful who gets hired as a police person. Second of all, you want to train people, and you want to make sure they know what the law is. In another case recently involving a Santa Fe policeman, we questioned that officer about what did he know about the law on disturbing the peace. And it was because he claimed he could have arrested a client on that basis. He didn't know what the law was. So it's critical that training, both in terms of knowing the law, de-escalation instead of escalating. I've been involved in many lawsuits against the Hobbs Police Department, and the biggest problem we faced there was their constant escalation. They'd get involved in a situation and turn it into a shooting where it wasn't one to begin with. It was just people arguing with each other. So it's critical that the police department be trained in how to de-escalate, how to handle people who are mentally ill, how to handle people who may be dangerous, but to do it in the way that's the minimally intrusive, minimal use of force. And that's essential. And then lastly, in the officers carrying out their duties, they need to be supervised and they need to be disciplined if they break the rules. And if the city is not doing those things, the taxpayer needs to know that, because otherwise we are all in serious jeopardy. And that's what we're aimed at. We want to know, what is the city doing to monitor, supervise, to hire, train, supervise, and discipline their officers?
Right. And, kind of looking back at New Mexico, how do other cities and counties in New Mexico handle this same issue? Because they're not all like Santa Fe. Some places do have more transparency.
Yeah.
And the fact of police officer discipline is public. What do you feel like that, points to?
Well, the clearest example of a jurisdiction which is far more transparent than Santa Fe is Albuquerque. And that's the largest city in New Mexico. And they turn over most of the IPRA requests for disciplinary records. They respond to and they turn them over. And if there are people who legitimately need some protection, people who are accused but not charged, or somehow their names get in there, you can redact them, you can take those names out, but show what happened to the given police officer, what was the finding, and what was the discipline administered. And Albuquerque generally does that. And I would hope that the city of Santa Fe would take a page from their records custodian, Ethan Watson. That may not be his title, but he's in charge of all of this there, and he's very forthcoming, and he believes the records of the people should be available to the people.
And in a perfect world, what do you think is the right fix for this problem? I mean, especially in Santa Fe, where for the most part, it seems like they don't have a whole lot of interest in changing these policies. Is this something that the legislature needs to look at? Like, what's the perfect way to fix it? Make it better, more transparent.
I mean, I think that the existing statute is sufficiently narrow that if the courts will just apply the law as currently written, that will do the trick. If the courts in our case, and I've already been approached by number of entities who would like to support us, press associations or the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government. There are many entities in this state that want to support the Santa Fe Reporter's effort here. And I think that if we can get the courts to reconsider their earlier badly thought out decisions and fix things, then we will not need to go to the legislature. And so that's my hope. And I think once we get back to matters of opinion being withheld, but everything else, the fact of discipline, the reasons for the discipline, if that can come out in public, then I think the public can properly monitor the city government and make sure that our police department is not running amok.
Right. And what do you think, what can Santa Feans do to support police transparency? People outside of the media and politics, just regular people.
Demand it. I mean, you're going to have an election. You elect city councilors, you elect the mayor. And when there's a campaign, ask people for their support on this policy. I mean, this policy is one that is imposed by the city, and it can be changed by the city. If the city wanted to provide these records, it could tomorrow, but it doesn't. And so I think it's essential that we hold our politicians feet to the fire and get their opinions while they're in running for office, when they're susceptible to wanting to listen to taxpayers, and then call them up and say, this is what you said to me in this meeting, and come on, now do it. That will make a big difference. And hopefully, these cases take a while, so I don't think we're going to have a decision before a year or so. But at some point, we're going to have a decision, and then it's important for the city to live up to it and for the people to ensure that they do. You know, if the people aren't engaged and making demands, then nothing changes.
Yeah, there's also the new public safety, the Health and Public Safety Task Force as well here in Santa Fe. So that they might look at that. There's no guarantees, but maybe they'll bring it up as well.
Yeah, I think that the problem is they're getting legal advice that says that they shouldn't give these documents over. And I think that people, when they hear it's legal advice, they then get scared and they don't realize they have the authority to do the right thing anyway. So I'm afraid it's probably going to take a legal ruling from the courts before the city will change its mind.
Right. And what I had forgotten to ask you about earlier as well was, with the city arguing that the records are a matter of opinion, even when, you know, someone's been disciplined for doing something, like, where do you think that argument falters or falls down? I mean, it seems a little bit ridiculous when you look at it. So I guess, how are they making that make sense to a judge or themselves?
So where it's coming from is that there are these poor appellate decisions, starting with this one from the 70s, where the court basically looked at the statute and said, well, I'm going to interpret very broadly here to protect state employees, state and local employees. And so they read out the word opinion, and they just said, look, anything having to do with discipline in a personnel record needs to be protected. And that's what they decided. And they just cut that off from the word opinion in the exception. What we're trying to do is get the courts to take a new look at it and realize that this exception is much more narrow. They basically just decided that what the legislature said was anything concerning discipline in a personnel file is protected. And that's not what the statute says. And that's what our goal is here.
Right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was the second interview in our Bring a Friend series. There are 3 more coming every Thursday at 5:30, although we are skipping next week for the Thanksgiving holiday. And if you like our local independent journalism, consider a gift to Friends of the Reporter at sfreporter.com/friends. And if you donate tonight, we will automatically put you in a drawing for a $50 gift certificate to 2nd Street, which is one of my favorite places to get a drink and nachos in Santa Fe. Whenever we're allowed to do that again, obviously no one's doing that right now, but hopefully soon, maybe things will be better. Anyway, thanks everybody for watching, and thanks again for your time, Dan. I appreciate it.
Catherine, it's been a delight. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care and happy